You either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. For a long time, Shaktikanta Das, the now ex-RBI governor, remained a hot favourite of the market and the government's golden-eyed boy. This was, after all, the same person Prime Minister Modi had trusted for rolling out demonetization and then GST. And then as RBI governor, he shepherded the country in and out of COVID, in the process becoming the longest-serving governor in decades. Before his already extended term was ending on 10 December of 2024, there were multiple news reports confirming yet another extension. It was almost like a done deal. But things started unraveling in November and then into early December. Cracks started emerging between the RBI and the government. See, the RBI was keeping interest rates high, convinced that inflation was still a problem and that growth wasn't. This is despite the RBI downgrading its GDP growth projection for FY25 from 7.2% to 6.6%. This is despite multiple growth indicators showing signs of fatigue, despite consumer goods companies complaining of dropping urban consumption demand, particularly from the middle class, despite incomes not growing fast enough and companies putting their investment plans on freeze. Despite all of this, RBI was keeping policy rates elevated. By the way, please watch the previous episode of The Bond Economist where we delved into all these issues in detail. And the government was soon coming to the rapid realization that despite all of these warning signs, their golden-eyed governor was not taking the growth slowdown seriously enough and instead was fixated on higher inflation caused by food, which government argues cannot be brought down simply by keeping interest rates high. The government's chief economic advisor, Anant Nageshwaran, first raised the issue in the annual economic survey, criticizing the RBI for excessively focusing on food inflation, effectively forcing the government to intervene in markets and bringing prices down and in the process hitting our farmers. And then Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal publicly criticized the RBI in a conference for reacting too much to food inflation.
But I think it's an absolutely flawed theory that food inflation should be considered while deciding on the interest rate structure. Food inflation has nothing whatsoever to do with managing inflation. That's a demand-supply situation.
Which is weird because generally government ministers do not openly criticize RBI, given that it wants to keep up the appearance that the central bank is independent. But that was followed by even the finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, stating at a public forum,
"The cost of borrowing is really very stressful. And a time when we want industries to ramp up and move building capacities, bank interest rates will have to be far more affordable."
Now, typically these conversations happen behind closed doors. It is rare for either the government or the RBI to criticize each other out in the open. And so, with RBI now on a collision course with the government, no one quite knew what would happen next. As Governor Das's end of term was approaching, there was radio silence from the government as well as the RBI. Will the otherwise popular governor get the extension that he was on track getting? Or would he be shown the door? So when Shaktikanta Das visited Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman a couple of days before his term ended, we still had no idea whether it was to shake hands to confirm an extension or to shake hands to confirm a goodbye. In many ways, it was like history repeating itself. Because a similar thing happened with Shaktikanta Das's predecessor, the guy he replaced 6 years back, Urjit Patel. Urjit Patel, by the way, an incredibly qualified economist with degrees from London School of Economics, Oxford and Yale, resigned in the middle of his term because of personal reasons. Now, it was widely speculated at the time that the real reason was a breakdown of the relationship between the government and the RBI. See, Patel fought tooth and nail against the government on a variety of issues. The electoral bond scheme, the government's demand for lower interest rates, tightening screws on public sector banks that had made too many bad loans to corporates, telling the government to keep its hands off RBI's reserves. It was actually a long list. In fact, according to the memoirs of former Finance Secretary Subhash Garg, Prime Minister Modi privately described Urjit Patel as a snake who sits over a hoard of money. So when Patel resigned, the government didn't want to take any chances and put its most trusted lieutenant, Shaktikanta Das, who was previously in the finance ministry, to lead the RBI. Government was like, this appointment cannot be a disappointment. He's our man. And It's actually come now full circle because Shaktikanta Das got replaced by someone who markets have no clue about. Another finance ministry insider, the revenue secretary, Sanjeev Malhotra, the guy whose job so far was to ensure that the government gets maximum revenues in its coffers. Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Urjit Patel, and in this episode, we get in-depth into the possible reasons why India now has a new central bank governor and how your economy could be impacted by these developments. As always, if you like this kind of content, feel free to buy me a coffee at the QR code or use the super thanks button below. First things first, why is the RBI and government so prone to fighting each other? Technically, the central bank of a country should be independent from the government because the government and the central bank have very different roles. The government's sole objective is to generate growth. After all, its survival depends on how prosperous its voters feel. And so any government, not just in India, but anywhere in the world, would ideally like to do everything in their hands to speed up growth. Spend crazy amounts, cut taxes, borrow insane amounts of money, deregulate banks and NBFCs, let them lend to anyone and everyone, simply fire up all the engines to max mode. Now, while this might be a good idea for a while, all steroids come with side effects. If you overheat the economy and have unsustainable fiscal deficits, you will have to deal with higher inflation and higher interest rates. As people start to demand more and more, the country's current account deficit increases because imports pick up. And we end up essentially spending more dollars than earning, eventually leading to the currency nosediving and causing a loss of foreign confidence and leading to an outflow of foreign investments. Meanwhile, if you are not controlling and regulating banks and shadow banks carefully, then they will make risky loans in search of higher profits, and when people will start to default, banks will eventually be left with a big hole in their balance sheets. And if banks fail, then a financial crisis can quickly become an economic one. Basically, if the government is left to its own devices, the car might accelerate to top speed for a while, but then there's a high likelihood that it will crash. Case in point, Pakistan and Sri Lanka in our neighborhood. So you ideally need an independent entity with a foot on the brakes, which is the RBI. RBI is that driving instructor that sits on the passenger seat of a learner's car and is constantly applying brakes as and when needed. It is the RBI's job as the banker to the government to say, look, I am not going to print more money just because you want to spend lavishly. If there is too much growth happening too soon and inflation is blowing up, then the RBI says, look, I'm raising interest rates, I'm applying brakes on growth to cool down inflation. The RBI also regulates banks and shadow banks, ensuring that they are compliant, tweaking regulations to ensure that they are not overlending to the riskiest parts of the economy. It comes to the RBI to be the grown-up in the room. However, sometimes it can be so much of a grown-up that no fun at all happens in the economy. You know, I remember going on this international flight once where the pilots were so obsessed with safety that they virtually had the seatbelt on sign for hours at a go, even when the plane was smooth sailing. And people needed to pee. There was literally a bathroom revolt happening in the cabin with the flight attendants. Similarly, the RBI can at times tighten the seatbelt so much and for so long that the economy feels too uncomfortable. And to some extent, it is healthy that the government and the RBI keeps debating with each other because that keeps a check and balance between the accelerator and the brakes. But usually to the public, to markets, it is a mature practice for both of them to keep a united face. Like, we respect what each other's strategies are and we are both sighted on a common economic vision. So where did Shaktikanta Das go wrong? So on the one hand, government ministers were publicly criticizing the RBI that it is keeping interest rates too high for too long. So the deciding moment, the battle of Panipat, so to speak, for Shaktikanta Das's governorship was on 6 December. Now in India, a 6-member Monetary Policy Committee or MPC headed by the RBI governor meets once every 2 months to decide whether to increase, decrease or keep policy interest rate on hold. This committee has 3 RBI members, including the governor, and 3 external members, with the governor having the deciding vote in case of a tie. So with all this criticism that was piling up, the question was, would Shaktikanta Das take the hint and in the next policy meeting on 6th December, act on it and reduce interest rates? But nope. Governor Das essentially said, screw you, I still think inflation is a problem, that the growth slowdown is temporary, and if needed, we will cut later. For now, I will continue to keep the interest rate unchanged at an elevated 6.5%. Two of the external members voted against his decision and in fact said that we should cut. But generally the RBI members vote in line with their boss, so the decision to not cut was passed with a 4-2 majority. And with that, Governor Das may have slammed behind the RBI door for good. Now, of course, in such things, we don't really know for sure what transpires behind the scenes. Was it the case that Governor Das himself was planning to retire? Was it that the government has second thoughts about his extension? Would Governor Das have remained governor if he delivered a rate cut in the December meeting? Who knows? The point is that within a week of that Monetary Policy Committee meeting, government seemed pretty okay with Shaktikanta Das walking out of the RBI for the last time. So now that we have a new RBI governor, what can we expect from him in terms of the impact on the economy? The problem in answering this question is that Sanjeev Malhotra, the new RBI governor and ex-revenue secretary, hasn't really spoken or written much about monetary policy in his career so far. So it's difficult to know where he stands on various issues. But given the atmospherics around the shift of guard, given the fact that in his career as a taxman, he has probably appreciated faster economic growth because that has always meant higher tax revenue growth. So it's natural for markets to expect a cut in interest rates in the next policy meeting in February 2025. In fact, the question that they have is, will the RBI cut by the usual quantum of 0.25% per meeting? Or will there be one short emergency cut of 0.5%? And how many cuts will there be in total? So how low will the policy rate be cut down from 6.5% currently? There are other unknowns too. Under Shaktikanta Das, it has become very expensive for banks and non-bank finance companies to make risky loans to the public, like unsecured loans, credit card debt, microfinance loans, etc. This was put in place because banks and financial companies were literally force-feeding Indians easily available credit at very high interest rates. And finally, the public was starting to default. And because of Das's tightening, retail credit growth sharply fell. And obviously, lesser credit available means that people who are relying on it for their consumption needs now have to scale down their purchases. So will Governor Malhotra reverse these measures to support growth? And finally, what will happen of the rupee? See, when it came to the rupee, RBI under Governor Das has been like that patriarchal Babuji in 90s Hindi movies who wouldn't allow the daughter to talk to anyone or go out in the night.
मुझे जाने दीजिए बाबूजी, प्लीज बाबूजी मुझे जाने दीजिए, बाबूजी प्लीज बाबूजी, बाबूजी.
RBI would heavily intervene in markets to keep the rupee stable. So if the rupee weakens, RBI would sell copious amounts of dollars, create a scarcity of rupees, especially if that was happening in the spot market. And in the process, the exchange rate would shore up. But scarcity of rupees also means that domestic interest rates move up, which is bad for growth. Also, keeping the exchange rate artificially strong means that the incremental benefit that exporters get from a weak rupee that makes our goods and services cheaper for the rest of the world, that benefit gets lost. So will Governor Malhotra dial down on the excessive meddling in foreign exchange markets that we've seen so far and consequently just let the rupee depreciate along with market forces? At this point, we don't know much about his thoughts on these issues. In his first press conference, all he has revealed is that he wants to ensure policy continuity and stability, which is basically RBI code for saying that we haven't really made up our minds. As and when these decisions come, rest assured this channel will be there to translate the boring speak to plain English for you. For more such insights, like, share and subscribe to The Bond Economist.